Good afternoon. Today we're going to start on our Introduction to Genealogy Part 2 on genealogical records. So I'm going to go over several different types of records that you'll encounter when you begin your genealogy research. I'm going to have several images, and then I'm going to share a few different screens as well. So once again, you always are going to start with yourself. But when you start searching for genealogical records, you want to find proof of a record that proves an event in an ancestor's life. So to do this, you usually need to go back to your parents or your grandparents to begin. A lot of times when I'm saying this, I'll say grandparents, but everyone's generations are different. Some people, it could be your grandparents that you have to go back to before you can start searching, because you want to go back to a generation that is not living today. Because keep in mind that most genealogical research is for those who are deceased and not living. And I know that sounds funny, but you think of the site Ancestry, it's to search for your ancestors. It's not to search for just your living cousins. So you will find fewer and fewer records for those who are still living and those who have only been deceased for a short period of time. And a lot of that is for obvious privacy reasons. So if you have a family member that passed away in the last year or even the last 5 years, you will find much fewer records available for them online than you would for others, and even access to their original records will be harder to get to. Information on vital records is time sensitive, and so that is subject to laws of each state and country that they reside in. And the reason I have this kind of broad statement, especially for Georgia right now, vital records are in a bill that are in the process of being under augmenting. So you always want to research the location you're researching to find out when the records began to be recorded and when they are allowed to be released to the public. That date is different for every state. Some counties it varies. Not everything is available for the same location and the same time period, so please do keep that in mind. You must also remember that simply because a person has passed does not mean that you will be able to find available records with proof for them, or that these records still exist today if they did to begin with. A quick example of this, both of my maternal grandparents, my mother's parents, they were both born at home, but this was even during the time that birth certificates were being recorded. But they did not have a birth certificate created or recorded until years after their birth. That was because they lived in a very rural area. It was not common at the time. And they did not, or at least for my grandfather, he did not get a birth certificate until later when he was, I believe, applying for jobs and then later Social Security. So you'll see a variance in different states as to why there may be a lack of records. That's why I say even if they were available. And then sometimes even say if they died when death certificates were being recorded, but again, they lived in a very rural area and they simply died of old age, it was a new practice, and so therefore a death certificate might never have been issued, recorded, reported, however you want to state that. So there was nothing there to be found to begin with. So you have to keep that in mind when searching for things. But once you have a record as proof, and that means that you have established that this record is in fact applicable to your ancestor, you want to apply all information to aid in your future searches. And I'm going to go through several examples of that. So these are some of the most common types of genealogical records. Most people usually begin with census records. For the US, those are from 1790 to 1940 US population census. There are others. None of these records are fully complete. I will be doing a census records class in the future that'll go into more, but that's the gist. Vital records are typically considered birth, marriage, and death, and then today we also kind of considered divorce records as part of those vital records. Church records, that can be a church history, minutes, member list, or a directory, if you will, funeral programs. Probate records are things like wills and estates, land records, deeds, court minutes, and all types of things like that. Military records, pension applications, registration and draft cards, service and discharge records, muster rolls. You can have immigration records, so passenger manifest, naturalization records, newspapers, which newspapers can give you a wealth of information if the newspaper was preserved or if they reported it to begin with. And then I'm going to talk a little on city directories at the end. So real quick, census records were began in 1790 to record the U.S. population. They're recorded every 10 years. These are called decennial census records, and they're released 72 years after they were last taken. So that means that the 1940 census was the last to be released, and the 1950 census will be released in 2022. At the moment, like I said, there's a bill in the House right now that is being done about the birth and death records possibly being delayed, so things can change. So in England, it's 100 years after the census was taken. So I'm actually looking forward to that 1950 census coming out. Many of the census records have been destroyed due to war or disaster. The 1890 census is kind of everyone's brick wall, so to speak, because hardly any of those exist. Out of the entire 1890 census, less than 1% of the names still exist, which is less than, or just a little over 6,000 names, I do believe. And once again, remember, most of these were always recorded in cursive, and so spellings will vary. I just have a tiny image here of a U.S. census in 1920 in Bulloch County as an example. So then we're going to go to vital records. Birth records. These are the earliest the earliest birth records were usually baptismal records. So these would have been recorded in churches. Baptismal records go back to more of European times. And the reason that you would have a baptismal record for most was infant mortality rate was so high, they wanted the child to be baptized as soon as possible in case they did not live very long. Then when you get to America, your churches vary. That's when you start having, of course, all different types of churches, types of religions. So, and a lot of those churches, again, were still persecuted. So not all of those records have survived. Individually, you can have family Bibles that were commonplace to keep birth, marriage, death, sometimes even other notes. But just because you have a family Bible that has birth records does not make it correct. So do keep that part in mind. Later, you might find newspaper announcements with births in there. That became more common in the 1900s. In larger cities like New York, Chicago, and places like that, you might find any type of announcements much earlier than more rural locations. When it comes to marriage records, those are the oldest vital record that you will usually be able to find. You can typically, and I say typically, find marriage records for couples going well into the early 18 and even 1700s throughout the generations. Those records were kept on a county level. So therefore, as long as you know where they were married, you can typically find where it was. Again, this is an introduction, but I do a lot of this based on Georgia, But you do have to keep in mind not every couple is from the same location. So for Georgia, the counties, all of those marriage records are still located within those. Many of them have been digitized as well as throughout the states. But since those were kept at a county level, that means that if that courthouse was burned or a tornado went through, a flood, those records very easily could have been destroyed before a time of digitization where there was a chance to be recorded. Two examples, at least for Georgia, come to mind for Burke County and Baker County. Not good for the bees. Both of those counties have had courthouse fires frequently, so they have had quite a lot of record loss. So if you're going to begin searching for vital records within your state, there's usually a book or a website that will tell you of all of the courthouse fires or disasters that have happened within each state and for each county. So that way you will not waste so much time searching for records that might not still exist today. And then of course, those earlier marriage records are always going to be much less information than they would be today. The earlier records are typically Mr. married Mrs. on this date, the end. Later, they'll become printed where they fill in, some of them will have witnesses or have who else was available. Every state varies on the type of format for their birth, marriage, and death record, and counties do. Death records were not recorded or required to be recorded until the early 1900s for most states. Some did record earlier. An official death certificate was even later. But there are several alternatives to finding death records. So examples of these are obituaries and death notices. A quick difference, an obituary is published in a newspaper by a family to say that that person has passed, whereas a death notice is something put in by the newspaper itself saying someone may have died in a certain type of accident. It doesn't necessarily give family information or anything pertaining to that person other than the name. It's more of just a notice of this event happened. Again, family Bibles can hold death dates, and then church and cemetery records as well. And just because you find a headstone with a birth or a death date and a name, that does not always mean that that is correct. If you ever go to a cemetery and you see stones that ever say in memory of an ancestor, that is an automatic indication that that headstone has been placed much later by descendants of that person. So the information that is on there has been put there much later. Also, a lot of veterans' headstones are put there. They're not actually buried there. So again, it's in memorial of that veteran. So this is a birth certificate of a great uncle of mine. And so if you have ever come to any of my classes, you know that I like to tab everything. I am a color code person. So I kind of have the same going with this to try to help out. So the blue arrows are for location, the red are for names, and the yellow are for dates. And then I have a little green one that has kind of extra information. So you'll notice that obviously there's not just three, there's more than that, or more than three little fields. So this is a copy of a New York birth certificate, and you can tell that this was the original. It's a photocopy. At the very top right, you see that the date this was recorded was March 12, 1918. But at the bottom, the date of the report, the bottom left, is July 12, 1901. And kind of in the middle, right here, the actual date of birth was May 24th, 1901. So that's how you know things were recorded at much variance in time. So a lot of times an event would happen, and you want to have proofs of this event. And in order to do that, you have to have people who were there at the event at that time. So we have the mother or the parents who were listed on this. I believe the mother was there at the time of the birth. I would surely hope so. The father might not have been. But this can give you some great information. So at the top, it's got State of New York certificate and record of birth, Abraham Litch. And this was very interesting for me. If it weren't for his parents' information, I actually would not have found him, because later he went by Charles. And I finally found a marriage record that had Charles A. Litch. So that was where I was able to find that. And so then it has male, white, and if you notice mother's name, Selma Litch, but right below it, and this is wonderful, and this is a pre-printed and it's typed in actually. It says mother's name before marriage, Selma Foss. So you might recognize some of these names from my first presentation. So it has the date of birth, May 24th, 1901, and it has place of birth, and then it has the mother's residence. And if you notice, those are the same. In other words, he was born at home, which was very typical of this time. And then if you keep going right here, it has father's name, Nathan Litch. And it's hard to see right here, but this was, I believe, saying mother's, I'm trying to read in here, mother's birthplace, which she was from Germany. And her age was 26. Wherever it has the dotted lines, it's kind of like NA, so it's either already stated or not applicable. So for occupation, she was unemployed at the moment. So there's the father, there's his address, or residence, and he was from Austria, and he's 30 years old. And so the color, again, it's all stated. And notice right here, it has occupation, that he's a baker. You might remember me talking about a baker in my last class. And one thing that is very interesting over here, this little tidbit of extra information that a lot of people might not look at, it has number of children born to this mother and number of children living. So by May 24th, 1901, Selma has had 3 children, but only 2 of which are living. And sadly, I did not find this birth certificate until much later, I guess, in my research. And so I did have a 1900 census with her where she had 2 sons. And her second son, Samuel, it took me a very long time. I could never find him. But I finally found on this birth certificate and my grandfather's birth certificate where she had lost a child, and it had to have been Samuel because he died before 1910, but he was alive in 1900. So he had to have been the child that she lost during this time. So right here, this gives me the name of a child, the sex, the race, date, location, who the parents were, what country the parents were from, how old they were, which will give me an estimate of a birth year, and it tells me how many children that the mother has had already and the occupation of the father. So that is a great deal of information from just a single birth certificate. And now I'm going to jump to a marriage certificate. This is actually the first record I ever had when I started doing my genealogy research. This is a photocopy of the original marriage record of my grandparents. I wasn't given this until after my father passed away, so this was my first real piece of the puzzle, and I've taken pretty much everything from here and stories that I've had. So this is, again, location is Wayne County, Michigan, in Detroit. And so the name's up here, and I've got arrows pointing both ways because all of these records are going to look a little bit different. This one doesn't have dates quite in quite as many places. So it has Elias Litch and Rachel Rosen. So Elias is 20 years old, and that's his name again. It has color Detroit, Michigan, and it says his birthplace was New York. Occupation, auto inspector. Father's name, Nathan. Heard that one before. Mother's maiden name was Selma Foss. And again, it has her maiden name. Excuse me, he was not married before. And then it has Rachel Rosen, who's 18. I would later learn that she was not actually 18. Her parents kind of lied about her age so she could get married. Told you you'll find no secrets. Whose resident is in Detroit, but her birthplace was in Russia, and she was a laundry worker. Her father's name was Louis, and her mother's name was Bella Lux. And her mother's last name is one of those I have found spelled many different ways as well. So down here it has the date of marriage as the 1st of August, 1929. And up here again, 1929, it has the certificate number. So this gave me my grandparents, it gave their ages, which approximate birth years, where they were born, who their parents were, their occupation. So that gave me an extra generation and gave me all 4 names of my great-grandparents in one document. I wish Georgia was like this. Unfortunately, Georgia marriage records were not like this until much later. And now we're going to go to a Georgia death certificate, and I know I'm kind of getting away from my family. This is a very kind of interesting record, and it's more of a Bulloch County record. You'll see lots of little of my arrows on here. Death certificates do vary in different states. The format is not always the same. So, but you will notice how, even though it's very hard, there are little numbers. Just the way I'm going to go back one, kind of like with the birth certificate, how you can go down. So when you get to a death certificate, you want to follow those numbers because that's typically the order it was filled out. So we have the location of Bulloch County, and that name is one that is kind of difficult to read. It is actually Zena Beasley. And if you look down, it says female, white, married. Her husband was David Beasley. Her birth date, I believe January 5th, 1880. She was 47 years old, 11 months, and I believe 6 days. So that was, they had to have known a birth date if they were able to do that, or if you knew one or the other. And again, I've got the little green arrows for the extra information. So her birthplace is Bulloch County. It's kind of difficult to read right here, but her father's name was Isaiah Parrish, who was from Georgia. Her mother was Sarah Bland from Georgia. And the informant is her husband, who was David Columbus Beasley, Statesboro. And it tells you the date that that was filled out. And then over here, the death date, which was December 11th, 1927. And kind of like to point out, interesting, she actually died on their wedding anniversary, which is quite odd. Well, sad, I'll say. And then right here, this is the box that is typically filled in by the coroner. This is, you can get lucky or not. In this case, the handwriting is very similar and you're able to read it. Oftentimes, because the coroner or a doctor has filled in this area, it is sometimes so difficult to read, it's almost impossible. Therefore, there's a number system not many people know about. So if you see this large kind of 4-6 that is written right here, that's actually a death index code. And so when death certificates began being issued, there was a number system for codes for the causes of deaths. So as time went on and the science got better and they knew more technical names, I guess, scientific names for causes of deaths, numbers would be added. So there's a website for that that I'll be able to post a link to later. But you have to remember a lot of maladies and illnesses in the past are not what we would call today. Just like you might see a cause of death as consumption, and many people today might not know what that was, but that was tuberculosis back then. So right here it has 46, and it's cancer of the womb. And it says that she had a duration of 5 months. And she contracted the disease at home. So she basically had most likely uterine cancer at the time. And how they knew that in 27, it said that she was only, 47 years old, and there was very likely little to any treatment. But you want to keep reading to try to get as many details, because right here is a date, but also it has place of burial, Mill Creek, and that is actually, I believe, Upper Mill Creek Cemetery, and the date. And it tells you the undertaker, the funeral home right there as well. So, death certificates will usually tell you if the person was buried, cremated, or removal. And the removal is typically if it was someone who maybe died during a war or something, so their body was removed. It might have been a crime of some sort. So you can find information of where their remains might have been taken. So you can get quite a great deal. You will see some interesting abbreviations on death certificates sometimes. UK and what is it? UK, DK, don't know, unknown. A lot of people will put that for the parents if they did not know the parents. The informant could be a child, it could be a spouse, a grandchild. So the information on here is only as good as the informant, because you have to remember, even though this is a vital record, it's not a primary source. The person is not living to give this information. So do keep that in mind. So I'm going to go over some church records real quick. There are various types of church records. It doesn't, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. Churches can refer to a great many denominations, but they all kept some type of records. They can be hard to find at times depending on how they have been passed down, and especially considering different churches, organizations, they were constantly rebuilding. So it depends if they rebuilt or if their church was destroyed, fire or something like that. But most often they're kept in the church, they're passed down to maybe members of the family. A lot of times you'll find copies or a history of these churches given to local libraries or historical societies. Other types of records, you'll have church minutes. They can vary in information. In the church minutes, if they were thorough, you can find list of who the members were, vital dates for ancestors, when a certain member joined a church. That could tell you when they moved there and maybe why. If they had children, if they were a widow, lots of little details like that can be kept in church minutes. Baptism records, which will tell you the child, and baptismal can give you a close guess of a birth date because they were usually baptized as close to their birth as possible. And again, Bible records are kind of lumped in with church records for obvious reasons. They're very hard to come by because the Bible, you think about it, a family Bible is one single Bible that is passed down. So therefore, instead of like genealogy where you start with yourself and go backwards, you're trying to find a single Bible that a ancestor had, but they might have had 8 children and it went to one of their children and then one of theirs. So trying to find who ended up with that Bible can be very difficult to trace. Probate courts, I'm going to kind of run over these real quick. I'm not going to dive into these until later. But these are court records, basically. So last will and testaments, estate records, inventories and appraisement. So when a person deceased, their will or their estate would be appraised. All of the things that they own, their home, their land, things like that. Deeds and mortgages, administration and guardian bonds, voter registration, land plats, annual returns, ordinaries dockets, administrators bonds, marriage certificates, years support, letters of testimony, probate court docket, court of inferior minutes, superior court minutes, common school fund, and again, I have that for Bulloch County since that's where we are. And that's actually very interesting. It's a list from the 1840s to the 1860s of who paid for their children's tuition to go to school. So it lists the children's birth dates as well, typically. Letters of administration, marks and brands, and homestead schedules. So that's a great variety of records. And of course, there are more varieties and there are fewer. Every courthouse is going to vary. If you plan to do research in a courthouse, always call before you go. Find out if they have any rules. Some let you take, pad in their paper to write. Some let you take your phone to make copies. Others have a copying machine that they rather you use. You're not allowed to take anything in there. And others only let you get certified copies. So always call before you travel to a courthouse to look through their records. And not all of their records are available. Keep that in mind because of privacy. And also, I have been to some courthouses that I looked up online. I thought I knew where everything was, but I did not realize that they were renovating, and so they had several of the original records just boxed up in storage while they were moving things. So even if you've been there in the past, call before you go each time. Military records, there's again, variety of records for these. The types of records depend on the time and the war. The first records are going to be mostly all handwritten and very difficult to dig through, and it makes it even more difficult considering so many of those men had the same name. Examples of these records are pension applications, registration draft cards, service and discharge records, muster rolls, and then you can also find compiled records that are created by local historians in different places that have these type of records already abstracted for you. The most common wars that you will find these records on for ancestors in the U.S. are the Revolutionary War, which was fought between 1775 and 1783, the War of 1812, which was 1812 to 1815, the Civil War, or the War between the States, which was 1861 to 1865. World War I, which is 1917-1918. World War II, which was 1941 to 1945. And the reason I leave out this, you'll notice I have a note, very few records are available for veterans of the Korean and Vietnam Wars, which those dates were 1950 and 1953 for the Korean War, and for Vietnam it was 1964 to 1962. The reason you will find hardly anything for either of those last two wars are because most of those soldiers are still living, especially for the Vietnam War, except for those veterans who passed during the war, and of course. But up until World War II, World War II is about the only war that you can find substantial records available online. Other than that, you have to search and put in applications to get records for your specific individual. You can't just search online for them and expect to have things come up online. So a lot of these records, especially the military, the more in the last century, the details are so specific that you have to have a good bit of information to know where to look for. Different universities specialize in military records, and of course the National Archives have a wonderful set of military records as well. Immigration records. Some people might think that, once you get far enough back in your tree, you'll start finding passenger manifest naturalization records. And that's actually not as true, because if you are finding your family in America back to the early 1800s and even further, then the possibility of finding those, quote, immigration records are going to get slim and slimmer. So unless you're able to be one of those lucky ones who can track to, some of those first ships to Jamestown and such. So this is kind of going over more of the recent immigration records in the late 1800s and early 1900s. So a passenger manifest is basically a list of the passengers on a boat. Didn't necessarily have to be a boat, though. You can also have a passenger manifest as a military record for the Navy, so keep that in mind. The names on the list are created when the passengers board, not when they're arriving at the new location. So typically, they detail their name, their age, where they are coming from, and their destination. So a passenger manifest, you'll see lots of little writing on it because it's kind of being check marks and so forth. It was written on when they boarded the ship from their original location before they left. So if it was a different country, so if they're coming to America, they're going to put like check marks that that person arrived. Those names are not going to be changed in the spelling, anything like that. They are basically checking that the person arrived. And then for naturalization records, you have different stages of this. You would have a person who would file for a petition, a declaration would be given if granted, and then the person would receive the certificate if the declaration was approved. It's, it is possible for different records to be filed in different states and or complete years apart. I'm going to show you an example of this as well. So in other words, a person could file a petition for citizenship in one state, and then they could receive their certificate in another state. They did not have to be the same location. So this is a passenger manifest in New York from 1899. This is something that a distant cousin of mine was actually able to help assist in finding me. And this is the arrival record of my great-grandfather Nathan and my great-uncle Harry, who his first name was Meyer. And it's difficult to see right here. The reason I was unable to find it is it was written very differently, but also the transcription, the type part, was typed completely differently. He actually immigrated from France. So even though he was from Austria, he left from France. So find my mouse. There we go. Right here, it has, instead of Nathan, it looks like, or the way it was transcribed was Marthau, which is very odd, Letko. And right there, we have a baker again. And then it has that he was from Austria. He's going to New York City. And right there is France, that his son was born in France while they were traveling. So I've been able to, again, go through and verify that this is the correct document, and his wife did not travel with him. This is his declaration of intention to become a citizen, and this is one of those that's kind of one of my favorite records. You will hear me talk about Nathan quite a bit. So he actually did his declaration in Connecticut. So the location is Bridgeport. So his name, Nathan Litch. His age right here is 35 years old, and he's a baker. says that his complexion is medium. He is 5 feet and 2 inches, and I have these little green arrows there for a reason. And he's also, again, 35, blackish gray hair. I love this because out of my mother's family who I grew up with, I am 4'11", whereas I have a cousin who is only about 7 months apart, and she's 5'11". She's my first cousin. So I obviously don't quite fit my mother's family. And so when I found this record, I realized why I never quite grew as tall as I wanted to be. And also I'm in my 30s with my gray hair, so I know where I got that. But this gives the exact location of where he was from in Austria. And it also gives his birthday, which oddly enough is the same as mine. And it gives the year, but then it also goes on to say where he resides now, where he immigrated to the United States from. So he immigrated from France, but he was a citizen of Austria. So he is declaring that he is no longer has an allegiance to the Emperor of Austria, and that that he arrived in New York and is living in Connecticut. So that is several different locations right there. So he arrived on or about the 21st day of August, 1901. But if you notice down here, the date of this is 1907. So again, and the arrival that we had was 1899. So that's those dates, immigrants, they tended to come back and forth, but also it's going to have different dates on it due to the fact that they left one place, they arrived in another, so those dates are going to be different. And he actually went back and forth, up and down to several different states. But this is one of my favorite documents kind of that he has, and it also even has his name down there. And don't forget, he was a baker. This is kind of going over newspapers, which of course are wonderful surprises. They take you back to that time period, but it depends on if there was a newspaper there, how much they recorded. So it's a hit or a miss. Larger cities have more information and would typically record things much earlier. Local newspapers of small towns are likely to have more personal information. I've noticed that a lot of the small town newspapers will have who visited who week to week, whereas larger newspapers, Savannah, for instance, that you can find the newspapers back to the 1700s, but you will find news around the world, even in the 1700s there. So it is not nearly as personal. Although those papers are very large, you have to dig for little tiny ads or pieces in there with personal names. Obituaries were not common in the older times. It was more of a death notice, like I mentioned earlier. And the most common in older papers was a prominent person if they died. So if a family was more well off, they could afford to put an obituary in there. A tragic event or a disaster or a noteworthy cause resulted in death. That was more likely to be reported than just, as we would say, a typical death, they would say, I suppose. All right, so I'm going to stop this share real quick. I'm going to go real quick. If you ever want to look at census records, you can go to Ancestry or Family Search. FamilySearch.org has all of the U.S. Census records available for free. You can just create an account there to view those, and it's a free account. But this is just kind of a list that you're able to see from 1790 all the way down. You can also find mortality schedules and various things like that, Indian census schedules and rolls. For military service rolls, and again, I am on Ancestry at the moment, but you can find draft, enlistment services, casualties, pension records. There's all different types of information you can go to. You can use Ancestry Library at home at the moment in many places. Heritage Quest, Family Search, these are all free resources that are available to you to search at home, since most aren't able to be out and about at the moment. Let's see. It's going to show a quick little image of this manifest real quick so that you could see a little bit clearer. So this is an example of that. So that's why you have little X's, you have check marks, and of course the ages, and they go all the way across. And a lot of times you will have these and there will be different colors of ink. And so typically, you know, written in black when they board, and then once they are leaving, or excuse me, departing the ship, everything's checked off in a different color. Military records are like this as well sometimes. And I was also going to show a quick example. So this is an example of a draft registration or a draft card for World War II. So this is my grandfather. These cards are very interesting because you can find, again, specific details. I kind of like how you can tell that the ink wasn't dried and they smudged the ink, but they wrote the name up at the top right there. And notice there's that one L instead of two, which on the birth certificate, he actually has two L's. But it has his birth date, where he was, the name of the person, and it has Mrs. Rachel Litch. A lot of times in the late early 1900s, women were referred to just as Mrs. and then would have the husband's name or the husband's initials. So if you were having trouble finding a death certificate or some document like that for a female, try searching under her husband's name and you might be surprised by what you see. I like this. My grandfather, 5'3½", so he grew 1.5 inches taller. Not by much, though. And as a quick example, let's see, I'm trying to remember who I'm searching for real quick. So this is my great-grandmother on my mother's side, who she died when she was 26 years old. And what's kind of interesting, little bit personal, I'm very much a genealogy nerd. So my great-grandmother was named Levincy, and a nickname for this was Vicey or LaVicey. And it wasn't until the other day that I realized that each of my great-grandmothers, my father and my mother's grandmother, were both born on the exact same day and the same year, but they were born in 2 different countries. So my other great-grandmother, Bella, was born in Russia, while Levincy was born in Georgia. And also my dogs are Belle and Vicey. But this is an example of her death certificate that took us quite some time to find because her name is listed as Mrs. J.L. Glenn. This actually has her parents' names, on there, J.L. Joyner, Saby Russ, and here the coroner actually wrote in print, all in capital, but it took us forever to find this because we had only been searching under her name. So her husband, my great-grandfather's the one who filled it out, but of course at the bottom he's listed as J.L. Glenn. This is moving too fast, I'm sorry. And Mrs. J.L. Glenn. So her name is actually nowhere on this document. So sometimes you have to know those other names to be able to find things to fill in. So this is just another example of a death certificate in Georgia. And you can see this name right here, or excuse me, this number that is kind of faded out. And that's actually another one of those codes for a car wreck, which is how she passed away. And I was going to jump one more time. This is to a different great-grandmother. And so this is a Michigan death record, which is slightly similar, but you can tell it was a little bit smaller because this was actually written later. But the handwriting in there, you see UNK, unknown, 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 which is kind of sad because the informant was my grandfather. So that was saying that he did not know much about his grandmother. So even though she was alive, excuse me, his mother, he did not know who his grandparents were. He knew her name, the name of her parents, but not where they lived, their last name, where they were born, anything. But then I come to find that her mother's name was Lillian, which, once again, that's my first name. I never knew this until I found this one particular document. So little things like that can give you that little jump of joy that you might not have ever had. So you have to learn to read those abbreviations, look for those little details, learn how to read the different documents, because like I said, every state's going to be different. And as you slowly start putting those pieces together, it becomes a puzzle. So you can do that once you get your puzzle started. So if you have any questions, please email me. My email will be posted on the beginning of the slide in the PowerPoint. You can also post any of your questions to the comments in the YouTube channel, and you can also post questions on Facebook. So I hope to see y'all next week. Thank you.